Hi, I'm Mickey Renders. I'm a PhD student at Queen's University in Environmental Studies, and I am one of the organizers of the Environmental Racism is Garbage Symposium. And I'm really happy to see everybody here at this panel. It's really a wonderful experience being here, and I'm going to introduce Tasha Beeds, who is the moderator, and will keep everything sort of going as much on schedule as possible. So welcome, and Tasha, I'll let you start the panel. Thank you.
Ani Tanse, everyone. I'm coming to you from the territories of Nswakamuk or Sudbury, Northern Ontario. Really happy to be here to moderate this panel and to be a part of this conference. It's quite exciting. And with that, this panel is titled Waste on the Move, and it is about rich countries exporting their waste problems to other countries, and that relentless circulation of waste. And so we've got 3 of our 4 panelists. One of our panelists was unable to attend, as Mickey noted. Morgan Mueller is unable to make it today, so I encourage y'all to check out his work. But we have Joan Kuick, Melanie Valencia, and Hannah Tollefson. And we have a bit of an order. So Hannah's going to go first, and then Melanie, and we're going to wrap up with Joan. So I have a little bit of extra time, and I'm going to get each of them to introduce themselves however they would like to. So with that, I'll hand it over to Hannah first. And I'll also be here, and I'll just be in the background to save the bandwidth as well. So welcome.
Hi, thanks, Tasha. I was just wondering, are we all going to introduce ourselves and go around, or should I just introduce myself and share my screen now?
I think we could do it that way. Like each person will introduce themselves as part of their overall presentation. That makes sense to me.
Okay, great. I will go ahead and share my screen then. PowerPoint. All right. So hi, everyone. I'm Hannah. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a settler of Norwegian, Irish, and English ancestry, and I'm joining today from the territories of the Lekwungen and Wet'suwet'en peoples on the Salish Sea in Victoria, where I grew up and have returned in these kind of digitally distributed COVID times. Usually, or right now, I'm also a PhD candidate in communication studies at McGill, where I study environmental media and kind of the political ecologies of shipping. And my involvement in the symposium is based on a video project that I made with my collaborator and friend, Sarah Wiley, who's a filmmaker. And our project is called Return to Sender. Yeah, so that's what I'll be talking about today. But yeah, I just want to thank all the panelists so far and organizers and keynotes as well. I'm really humbled to be kind of part of this alongside all of you, and to thank the organizers as well. Mickey, Hillary, Lori, Myra, Jacob, and all the other people I haven't yet met, I'm sure, who are a part of it. It's been really wonderful. Yeah, so I guess I should actually properly start this slideshow from current slide. Somehow with all of this Zoom, I still have never actually shared my screen. And so I hope that this goes okay. But so as I said, my part in the symposium was based on this collaboration that I did with my friend Sarah. And so my reflections today will just be kind of on some of the things that we learned in working on this video project together. So I'll say a few things about the stories that we document in the piece, and some of our visual and kind of like formal strategies and how they tie in, we think, to the theme of waste on the move. So the video that we made tells 3 kind of stories, and the first 2 are kind of about waste repatriation, and the last is kind of a speculative foray into waste futures and imaginaries. So the first tells the story of the Cayenne Sea, which was a cargo ship that sailed the ocean for 2 years between 1986 and 88, looking for land or sea to dispose, I guess, of its 14,000 tons of toxic incinerator ash that it was carrying from incinerators in Philadelphia after many landfills in the US refused to take it. So various ports in the Caribbean and in other parts of the world refused to let this ship dock. It's suspected that much of its toxic cargo was dumped overboard, but in 1988, it was presented in Haiti as fertilizer and dumped on the beach outside of Gonaïves, where for many years it sat kind of poisoning the lives and livelihoods of Haitians who also kind of worked hard to advocate to have this trash, this toxic ash returned to the US. And finally, about 13 years later, after kind of organizing around what they called Operation Return to Sender, this ash was finally brought back to the US via Florida. So as we began to kind of follow this story and look into its history, a similar story of trash repatriation emerged in the news, kind of closer to where we lived, closer to our home, when 69 shipping containers of contaminated recycling were finally returned to Canada after being falsely exported as recycling and left to rot in Manila for about 6 years. So for us, these kinds of return to sender stories represent moments when the kind of denial and distancing of the kind of like and disposability of these kind of colonial waste management regimes breaks down. And with those moments of breakdown, the kind of rituals and infrastructures of forgetting that this kind of waste management infrastructures rely on, kind of that fails, and the waste kind of returns in a way. So in kind of representing these stories, we learned from conversations that we were having with activists who are involved in these two cases. And we were also learning kind of from people who study and talk about waste and recycling, like Samantha McBride, Max Lee Brown, and Myra Hurd, and among others. And from these, what we were learning, one of the things that we wanted to kind of avoid was in telling these stories or thinking about these things was the kind of moral scripts that often guide green consumerism and the kind of moral economies of recycling that take away from important questions of inequality, upstream considerations, and the kinds of technical and material questions that kind of guide more specific questions about what's being recycled, where, how, what does that mean? And so in a related way, we wanted to avoid the kinds of moralistic and sometimes didactic genres of documentary filmmaking, and the kinds of scripts that sometimes privilege, sorry, I don't know if you can hear my dog, that privilege individuals over collectives and human will over kind of more systemic understandings. So a couple of different methods that we kind of tried to do following that. One of them was to kind of, was inspired by the work of the artist and theorist Hito Steyerl, who talks about the trash, or she talks about the poor image. And so following her, we kind of wanted to embrace and reanimate discarded internet images, gleaning what we often called trash images. So for Steyerl, the contemporary hierarchy of images is based primarily on resolution. And it's in this context that she kind of defends what she calls the poor image, which she describes as an image that's been countlessly transferred, reformatted, images that have kind of decayed as a result of kind of sharing, editing, and collective processes of distribution. And these low resolution images for Steyerl are kind of discarded from commercial circulation and kind of represent the afterlife of images. And so kind of gleaning these images for us meant finding, uploading, editing together cell phone camera images, low resolution, kind of cliched, poetic shots of trash bags, images from dated cable news and documentaries uploaded and reloaded to YouTube, along with some of the low resolution kind of Skype interviews that we did, including all of the glitches that often resulted from kind of unstable network connections. And so another visual technique that we used could be called desktop cinema. That's what Sarah told me it's called. She's more of the filmmaker, or more simply just called screen recording, which basically involved like recording our laptop screens while we looked up different places on Google Maps, doing image searches, looking up definitions, and then kind of using these in the video itself. So for us, this was a visual technique to kind of position ourselves in the film, to show ourselves as editors of images, and to kind of break from a view from nowhere, and to kind of insert ourselves as these novice researchers, non-experts, who are kind of fumbling to piece together this multi-scalar story. And so the final kind of technique or method that we used that forms the last part of the video, was to kind of play with to create a kind of speculative element at the end. And I think this was motivated by a couple considerations, primarily two, one of which was that I think one of the things we were first drawn to, or kind of captivated, or not, I guess we were first drawn to this Cayenne-C story in a sense because it seemed so absurd, kind of one of those instances where reality is stranger than fiction. The notion that a barge of ash would sail and be shipped around the world for years, with all of the labor and fuel that would entail, seemed kind of preposterous. But as we looked into this story, and into the kinds of economies and movements of waste, we soon realized that this is actually a very common practice, and that it kind of makes sense from within certain economic and imperial systems that organize production and disposal. So as part of our video, we wanted to kind of play with this tension between what seems at first absurd and then from another perspective is rational, and then to kind of flip that again. And so that's kind of part of one of the ways that we wanted to tell a kind of speculative story. And another thing that motivated this kind of speculative element, was followed from one of the conversations that we had with Leia Guerrero, who is she's the country director for Greenpeace Southeast Asia and the Philippines. And she was involved in the local advocacy that led to the repatriation of the containers to Vancouver. And she really characterized this kind of Canadian exporting of trash as a form of toxic colonialism, where Canada kind of presumes access to land and labor for the disposal and processing of waste, as well as not accounting for the kinds of impacts of transportation related to fuel emissions and other things. And specifically, Leia connected this kind of Canadian toxic colonialism to the kinds of the green and smart image of Vancouver as a city, which she argues really relies on externalizing its waste and through exporting. And so this led us to kind of want to play with the kind of green city images, and the kinds of aesthetics of smartness and zero waste that it relies on as well. And so to kind of play on the futures imagined by these designs, we drew on corporate ads for smart city operating systems. The one shown here is from Siemens Future Life, which is a promotional video to show their kind of urban operating system. Some promotional videos from Sidewalk Labs in Toronto, and from certain kinds of waste management innovations that they had. So what we saw in these promotional videos was a kind of future image of urban space defined by automation, seamless flows of information and circulation that seemed kind of devoid of dust and decay. And we wanted to kind of juxtapose these corporate images with the kinds of more collective image making that we found on the internet, or the trash images, and kind of evoke the dissonance and the dystopian elements of these aesthetics and kind of overlay them with the kinds of materials and inputs and outputs that they seek to exclude. So that's all for me. Thank you.
I was muted. Thank you so much, Hannah. That's an incredible work that you're doing. Very, very provocative and very powerful. We're going to go next to Melanie Valencia. And then if you have any questions, make sure that you jot them down. You can even jot them down in the chat as we're going, just in case, if you're like me, sometimes I forget. So if you've got questions, feel free to put them into the chat, and then we'll pull them at the end of the panel presentations. All right, Melanie, welcome. And again, I'll hand it over to you now, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Tasha. And I want to emphasize just how grateful I am to be part of this group. I'm so impressed with the work I've seen with all of the exhibits. I haven't finished seeing all of them. It's so rich and just such wonderful work being done in this very, very necessary field. I am currently a PhD student in focusing in circular economy and the social dimensions and value of the circular economy, trying to connect social justice and environmental justice to circular economy. And for me, it's truly an honor to be able to present this work, because I've been trying to connect my research to more activism. And I do believe that, what Hannah has been doing and what other artists have been doing here is truly communicating better what we're doing with our research. And I think that's extremely important and valuable. And this is actually part of my piece for this exhibit is actually called Mycorrhiza. And although it's not specific to the type of waste on the move that Hannah was discussing, I actually wanted to build on that. So I'll share my screen now. And so one of the critical portions of understanding waste is defining it. And I took this video because I thought it was so relevant to how we look at political ecology in terms of waste, and how we turn something that is very much alive and from nature into something that is dead and is no longer valuable for us as a society. And it is truly a construct. So I really like this definition from Gidwani and Reddy as waste, not a historical given, but rather it is a mobile description of that which has been cast out or judged superfluous in a particular space time. And I think that the key portion here is the space time, because if there is a reason that many justify the import export of plastic waste, for example, is that it will be valuable elsewhere. And I put the picture of the Coca-Cola glass bottle because I'm actually from Ecuador. I do my research in Ecuador, and I've interviewed and worked with waste pickers here in Ecuador. And they always talk about this moment when suddenly glass was valuable. So many of the people that live by the dump site used to go to the dump site as a commons where they would gather food, they would gather wood to cook, to be able to cook. They would gather toys or other objects that they would keep for their own use. And suddenly someone came and told them that if they gathered the glass, they would buy it from them. And this is 60s. This is the 60s, and people started gathering glass and started selling it. Now, if in Ecuador, glass, even though it is a recyclable material, it is seldom recycled because the market value for glass is extremely low in Ecuador. So it is very, very heavy, and waste pickers will not get more than 5-6 cents for the kilo that they collect. So they no longer pick it out in comparison to picking out cardboard or plastic that they will actually be able to get a better price for. So what is valuable suddenly, or would have been useful, suddenly was not. Whereas in other countries, glass is still a valuable material, and it's still recycled, or rather, it is valuable for governments to ensure that they don't end up in landfills. So there are strict regulations as to how it is managed and recovered. And this brings me to the piece I am currently presenting at the virtual symposium, which is mycorrhiza. And the idea of this piece was to show how there is this network of people that resembles the network of fungi and roots that exchange nutrients. So for one of these persons in the network, a material was no longer useful, and it would have become waste if it had not been found by somebody else who could manage to use it. And the key portion here, the difference is somebody actually took the responsibility for that. And if you go on the piece, you can actually navigate what is being exchanged for what. In Ecuador, bartering is very common, and it used to be indigenous practice as well. So smaller groups and social movements are really growing to truly connect these valuable materials with the right people that could actually make use of those. And otherwise, right, we're trying to figure out where a way is. And in Ecuador, as it is in most of the world, a way is truly managed by cities. A way, as in landfills and dump sites. In Ecuador, what you're seeing now on the screen is actually a map of Ecuador and where all of the landfills and dump sites are located. And because there are 221 municipalities, there are actually more landfills and dump sites because they have to each take care of their own waste. And all of these areas are really sacrifice zones as Lerner defines them. And as I was telling you before regarding the waste pickers, many of the waste pickers actually depend on the materials that they can get from them. But something else that is happening to these dump sites is that other waste is arriving, other unvaluable waste. And so there is valuable waste that is arriving, and I'll segue into the unvaluable one. But this is actually the night souls that was known as honey in China more than 2,000 years ago, where organic material was being used. And I say this because this is also in motion, right? So organic waste represents more than half of all the waste that is being produced around the world. And when we look at the difference, well, now we see this globally, but before it was a divide between urban and rural areas that required the nutrients that were actually obtained from human waste, from feces and urine, that are no longer being recovered. And I took a look at the poop train because I think it's a wonderful reference to how the times change in this space-time spectrum of what waste is and where it moves. The poop train is actually a famous podcast episode from Radiolab, if you're into that type of podcast, that shows how there used to be a poop train from New York that was traveling around the United States to put the poop somewhere as a fertilizer, but nobody wanted it. And there are a few reasons why. And Hannah also talked about how there was organic waste that was being exported, but terribly managed, put in beaches instead of actually being used. And what matters there is also the scale of the material we're discussing. So how are we decentralizing these systems so that they are useful rather than moving and becoming absolutely unuseful for communities? And for me, truly, this motion of material becomes relevant when looking at this article by The Guardian that came out. I believe it was 2019, when China closed its borders, and in the global value chain world, they were saying, well, this is the reverse China effect. Suddenly, China did not have the hub for the place where things were going. But if you see what happens there, and it was so strange to me that morning. I remember it so clearly, that suddenly the Ecuador, if you see it right there, it shows up. Ecuador was suddenly a hotspot for plastic waste. I think the majority of people hear about the Southeast Asian countries receiving the waste, but suddenly Ecuador was also part of those. And there was a work that was done by this researcher, Maria Fernanda Feliz, that you see on screen, and colleagues, are all colleagues from the Zero Waste Alliance in Ecuador that I'm part of. How was it that suddenly Ecuador was a place where waste was coming to? And this comes from a tariff line in our customs system that is 3915, that you can see right here, and how Latin America is going to start receiving plastic waste from the US, actually mostly from the US. And last year there was a whole conversation for the regulation to be passed on rationalizing plastic use. And what was interesting in that conversation was that the majority of the plastic that was being imported was actually being imported by industry, because according to the national regulation, municipalities cannot import plastic waste or any type of waste. So it was industry that was importing this plastic, supposedly to be used as primary material for their own purposes. And more than half, or about half of that material, was actually dirt. So we are moving these tanks, these huge ships, with half of it being plastic and half of it being dirt, creating all of these greenhouse gas emissions. And then the other portion is they are not sufficiently clean to be used by industry. So in the end, industry is losing money through this process. And well, in the end, they do their checks and balances and say, well, this is good enough. And then the rest of it, all of that is not pure enough, will end up being managed by municipalities, all of those places that we just saw on the map in Ecuador. So it is not as visible. And it becomes problematic, particularly because many of these companies that are importing the plastic all talked about how there isn't enough supply in the country for the plastic materials that they need, because they are actually trying to sell elsewhere in the world with this greenwashing of of giving material secondhand, or rather secondary plastic material a new use. So this is terrible. Just right off the bat, saying, how are we ensuring that the claims of these organizations are adequate? And if you ask them, the majority of them, they think they're doing it right. So that's also part of how are we educating ourselves around environmental justice. And well, I guess many of you are familiar with the work by Break Free from Plastic and the brand audits that show which brands are the ones that are polluting the most. This is based on the pieces of waste recorded in beach cleanups in the majority of places. But what happens is that who is being affected by these claims of import of the company saying that there is no plastic, that they have no way to obtain the material, is actually waste pickers. And for the work that I've been doing, and I've been doing this with a lot of collaborators, is that instead recyclers said that nobody wants to buy it from them, nobody wants to pay a good enough price for them to have a decent living. So it's not, and I guess I should clarify, it's not just the environmental impact of importing the waste, pretending that it's going to be used in the industry and then dumping it in the landfills, but also affecting the market prices from which waste pickers depend to obtain a livelihood. And I added the phrase of the old is dying and the new cannot be born, actually from Nancy Fraser's book talking about populism, but she talks about how there has been great work in recognition, but not so much in redistribution. And last week, there was we passed a law in Ecuador that recognizes the role of recyclers, and is about to give them social security, which really truly became so much more material than I had expected, because I was advising that group. But it did not, the law did not ensure that there would not be import of materials, so they are still unprotected in that regard, which is in the end how they are obtaining their livelihoods. And because I did see Hannah's work, there's also the fact, and I showed the brands before, because there is a big movement for extended producer responsibility to ensure that these brands are the ones that end up paying for their waste to be collected, and that also reduces the financial burden for municipalities and cities. But there is also the fact that all of the plastic waste that is washing off the shores of beaches do not even belong to those beaches. And the one I'm showing you on the screen is actually in the Galapagos Islands. And what we've seen, because I've worked with researchers there, is that the plastic that is arriving to the shores is not even from a material that would have been imported to Ecuador or would be manufactured in Ecuador, but rather from ships, particularly from Chinese ships that are on the sidelines of the national park, that are illegally fishing. But many of those do not have a brand that could be recognizable. I mean, it helps, shapes help, and all of the branding that many of the brands put into making their bottles or their materials recognizable helps, but is definitely not enough for the majority of these plastic pieces or other material pieces that wash ashore, and to make anybody responsible. So extended producer responsibility suddenly is not enough. And there are other materials instead that are even harder to trace, and this goes back to my point on the biological cycles instead. because we talk about microplastics, we talk about plastic pollution from all of these materials, but we're not talking about all of the chemicals that are now as emerging contaminants in our water. And this is all traveling beyond borders, whether we like it or not, whether we accept it in our products or not. It's traveling farther now. It's a great thing that we can that we're tracing COVID through the water, through wastewater treatment facilities. But if it is detectable, that also means all of these other materials. And I'm actually a chemist by training. I know this is an issue. We are increasing the number of contaminants that are not being traced, and this is waste on the move still. Much harder to assess, much harder to follow, to make anyone responsible for, and it requires systemic change to avoid for concentrations to be higher, and to acknowledge our interconnectedness with nature and each other. And I wanted to close just highlighting the work that an organization I know, a company actually, started, because they what they've been trying to do is, and if any of you are familiar, you'll recognize the brand, it's called Alegramo. They're in Chile, and what they were trying to fight was this they call it the poor tax as well, that small people in marginalized neighborhoods pay more for basic materials, and they also get everything in disposable bags. And what they did is they put these vending machines in the neighborhood shops, so that the neighborhood shop still benefits from that. But they do this all in reusable containers. And what is the most relevant for me is that we, from Latin America, finally there's it's not this terrible world of appropriation, of stealing intellectual property from plants again, and all of this, but rather now Algramo is in New York City, showing people how they can actually use reusable packaging for their detergents, for their personal care products. And we are, as Latin Americans, I feel so proud that we are exporting this type of frugal and social innovation that is also getting rid of this tax, but also meaning that we are in a way trying to again avoid for waste to be collected that could potentially end up again in our backyard, particularly for Ecuador, as you saw for with the example that I showed you. So I wanted to end in this exciting and hopeful note, because all of what I've mentioned are challenges, and all of this waste that is moving is not just the visible waste. I'm talking also about the very hard to trace waste, and what it means for borders. So thank you. That's it for me.
Thank you, Melanie. What an incredible presentation. Very thought-provoking. And thank you for ending us with hope, because it's hard to find that sometimes. And so I appreciate that as a grandmother. I really do appreciate that. We're going to go right over to Joan Kuyik, and I'll get her to introduce herself and carry on just for sake of time. Thank you again, Melanie.
Well, it's an honor to be on a panel like this. I'm Joan Kuyik. I am at least on one part of my family, an 8th generation settler. I live on Anishinaabe land in Ottawa at this time. I've been a community organizer and a writer for all my life. And a good chunk of that was in Sudbury, Ontario, which is the home of Canada's largest mining community. 150 years of mining, over $1 trillion worth of wealth taken out of the lands. It's part of the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850, which was signed to get access to mining lands, actually, in Northern Ontario. It's in court right now, but basically the Anishinaabe got less than nothing out of it because they lost access to their lands and to the animals and to their livelihoods. I'm going to talk a little bit about mining because it hasn't come up here. One of the things I worked on over the last few years was called the theory and practice of perpetual care of contaminated sites. And I was writing a literature review for the Giant Mine environmental assessment. The Giant Mine is in Yellowknife. The mine only lasted there for about 50 years. It left behind 237,000 tons of arsenic trioxide that had been blown into the drifts and shafts under the city, which is on the shores of Great Slave Lake, and is the home of the Yellowknives Dene. The environmental assessment was to talk about how that waste could be contained. Frankly, they haven't got a clue how to fix it. Everything that would be suggested is too dangerous to workers in the community. And so they're planning to freeze it in a block of permafrost that'll somehow last forever. That study did a number of case studies and looked at the worst contaminated sites on Earth, all the major sacrifice zones and the best practices that had supposedly been brought in to deal with them. Those sites ended up being mines and nuclear waste sites. And in both cases, like some chemical sites, that can never be fixed. The contaminants can only be contained, and they have to be prevented from moving and leaching into the waterways and the land all around these areas. So in Yellowknife, there's enough arsenic trioxide to poison the entire planet, quite frankly. And if it was starting to leak, and they were worried about it affecting the entire Mackenzie River system. We build these things and have since the industrial age that cannot be fixed. And we need to understand the awesome cost of the minerals and the kind of life we take for granted. As the other speakers have said, this toxic ash, these plastics, the chemicals that we release into the environment are a cost that will be paid for generations and generations to come. We need to ask when we're building them, should they even be built? And a lot of people do. It's not as though the we is everybody. And the people on these calls are very much not the we that are doing that damage. And I think it's important when we talk about how we're going to bring about change to be careful about using we. I think that trashes often the hard work people are doing to try and make changes and cuts us off from each other. It diminishes the hard work that all of the people on this conference are doing, for example. What we need to do is figure out how we, the people on this call and other people involved in the movement, to try and transform our Wendigo economic system, as Winona spoke about, have got to figure out how we work more effectively together. What do we do to bring the kind of wonderful work that's being done by artists and filmmakers and storytellers in this conference to the broader world? What do we do to enable us to feel strong together, to feel that we have power to bring about change? Because frankly, I think what stops us in most cases is despair. And I'm not sure that it's helpful that we don't learn. We don't learn when we're being yelled at. We don't learn when we're feeling defensive. And I think we need to look at the ways in which we help each other learn in environments which make it safe to say, I don't know what I did, and I'm really sorry. in my mind, the change takes place on sort of three levels. There's the massive resistance that grows up and is triggered at particular sites. The fight against Line 9, the fight against Line 3, Standing Rock, the fights by the Yellowknives Dene to try and get compensation for what happened at the giant mine, the people in Haiti who worked like hell to try and get that toxic waste cleared up. All those people who are part of Black Lives Matter and Indigenous land back movements are the people who are on the front lines and are fighting just to protect the very land and the waters that they love and they know. What Jacinda Mack says, protecting what we love. It's a love story. Those struggles, when they erupt, need to be supported with everything we've got. We need to be doing the hard work of building alternatives. Any of those we know how to do, but a lot of them don't apply in large urban areas, and we're stuck with 60% of the world's population living in urban areas and more being driven into it all the time. And I think we need to start figuring out how we deal with that. What do we do? We need to start talking about how we heal the sacrifice zones, how we reclaim them, how we take care of them. And we've got to acknowledge they're there. In a place like Sudbury, where I lived, they brag about the regreening, the massive regreening. Well, they've regreened 35 square kilometers. It's the same size as the tailings impoundment that is going to be there forever and is still growing. So the kind of lies that are told about the regreening of these zones needs to be taken up and dealt with. And then those of us who live in the belly of the beast, those of us who have a government that we can't stand, have got to figure out how we make our own bastards accountable. And if you talk to anybody from the global south, whether they're Indigenous people in Canada or people from Africa or Latin America, they're going to tell you to get our own government under control. And we're not good at it. I mean, some of us have been trying forever. We're not very good at it. I can tell you all sorts of failures. And I think we need to get better at figuring out how to do that. We have to take government seriously because, frankly, there's no other way to try and hold back the onslaught on our environment and on people. Even people who like me, who support Indigenous self-governance and Indigenous control over their lands, have to understand that the Canadian government is a big part of the problem, and we've got to deal with Canada. And certainly Winona's pushing us to get our own government under control is really important. There's a lot of things besides one pipeline under the Mackinac Strait to deal with. And part of the problem is we're so totally overwhelmed by all the problems we're dealing with. They all feel like separate issues, but in fact, they're the same thing. They're all part of a colonial capitalist system that only deals with commodities that can be measured in dollars, that trashes and destroys the intimate relationships I have with my ancestors and with the land and the people and the plants on it. And we need to figure out how we deal with economics differently and push that discourse so that so that we can start creating a different world together. What you do matters. What we all do matters. And I think we need to figure out how we celebrate that together so we can do it even better and keep doing it for the rest of our lives. Thanks.
Shimigwech Kananaskomtin, Joan. That was a really powerful way to bring us to a close in terms of the presentations. I'm not sure. I'm just struck I'm struck by all of the combined presentations. Each of you really spoke to one another. And Joan, your ending words to rally us, to bring us together, for me is very very heartfelt, and I completely concur with you. I don't know if anyone has. Yeah, yes, Joan can be our next prime minister. There we go. um, Melanie and Hannah, thank you again. Are there any questions? Maybe we'll open it up for questions. We've got a little bit of time left. Does anyone have any questions for any of the panelists? Or any comments that you want to share? Perhaps put them in the chat. And or if you want to speak directly to the panelists, I think we're formal but informal. I tend to go more informal because academia, can be way too formal sometimes. So if there's any, thank you so much for the work you've done, everyone. Yeah, I'm very struck. I had a couple of questions actually, and maybe I can ask mine, and if anyone else has any, we can turn to that. It kind of connects for me with what Joan was saying and what Hannah brought up, and also connects to Melanie too. That's something that I think is connected to all threads through all of the work. And that is that importance of motivating, whether it's through art or whether it's through story. What are some concrete ways, or what are the ways that you think people can be motivated to care, right? Because Joan spoke about that. There's this we concept, but how many people? There's 25 of us right now, right? There should be 200, there should be 300, 400, right? At a symposium like this. So how do we motivate people? How can art motivate people? How can stories motivate people? How do we motivate people to shift their approaches to government? How do we motivate the government? Just as a starting point, maybe. Hannah, did you want to go answer, or Melanie?
I'd
Yeah,
love to go, because I
please.
feel like I'm in that popcorn exercise when I just really
Yes.
need to pop after, because I got to react to Hannah's, but also I really wanted to react to Joan. I think for me, as a previously trained chemist, I always had this issue with treatment. I just couldn't believe this is the best way we could treat. Wait, like, is this really what we're doing? And when you look at the discourse regarding what we can do, and going back to your actual question, Tasha, I do think that people are, I mean, for me, telling these stories, because I feel like the technical portion can only do so much. For me, gathering the stories of the people that are doing this care work, because I didn't really talk a lot about that in my presentation, but that's actually what my piece is about. It's about circular care and what people's work is, and their everyday, how their everyday actions actually matter. And I do think that we, even though of course I would love 200 for people to be here today, I do think that we don't recognize that these stories are circular care, right? They're very much invisible, and perhaps that's what I wanted to ensure or emphasize in my presentation regarding this recognition stories. How much we do need to do recognition, but we also need to ensure that the material conditions for people that are doing this work is scaled. And going back to Joan's thing about, okay, like many of the solutions that we have really do not apply for urban systems. And I think some for sure not, but some perhaps yes. I'm actually staying with friends now who have never composted before, and I just started separating them, and they found a place, and now they're doing it. I do think that there are a lot of people that are in fear to get started, and we need to push a little bit, just help a little bit, and make that happen so that it does. It's a little push, and suddenly it starts working.
So true. Thank you. Hannah, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I can respond. Thanks, Melanie, for your comments and for your question, Tasha. I guess two things come to mind for me, both based on the other panelists and also just from a comment that I saw Myra make about kind of this idea of revealing to Canadians how much waste and contamination we're leaving and exporting to other places is, I think, something like storytelling and art and other modes of communication can emphasize is the kinds of costs of our actions that often are not included, like the forms of externalities and things that get kind of not taken into account when decisions like building a mine go in, or to kind of create waste management schemes that just export things that are disposed of. So I guess that's one thing. But I guess another thing I was really struck by that Joan said that really, I don't know, resonated for me, and I think is really powerful, is this idea that what we do matters, but having that be something that we actually celebrate as opposed to something that we're just kind of horrified by. I think that it can feel really overwhelming, like the scale of damage. But I think this idea of, yeah, like celebrating the impacts that people working together can have, and kind of amplifying again, like what she said, people who are on the front lines, amplifying and supporting those people, I think is really important.
Oh, thank you, Hannah. Joan?
Okay. I guess what I want to say is we have to understand how hard people are already working. And this system is dynamic and devouring. It's a Wendigo. It's eating our lives and our children's and our grandchildren's lives. And we are fighting like hell to hold it back. We are doing what we can. And it doesn't mean, I think we don't realize what would happen if people weren't doing what they were doing.
That's true.
And I think that kind of exhaustion that people feel is about holding it back. And we need to, I guess what I'd say is let's try and be more efficient about the work we do together.
Yes.
How do we do that in a way that allows us to last doing this for 50 years instead of having burnouts, at the age of 25? And it seems to me that we can learn how to do that together, and we can do that much, much better. And the only other thing I'd say in that one is that the other thing that's crucial is we need money.
Yes.
Capital is controlled. All the money is controlled by the state or the corporations and by individuals.
Yes.
And I think we need to be thinking when we're trying to build our movements about how we share what we've got in a much more effective way. And I know that's a huge challenge to some of my white friends, but I think that that's a big question, and that we need to figure out how we do that better. I'm going to stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Joan. And I'll just mention Sunita had noted that corporations and state nations, the power structures and waste flows they have built are hard to dismantle. So as long as they make profit, right, it's hard to dismantle those structures because they're continually reliant upon that profit, which goes to what Joan says. And so I like that notion of the takeaway being there is something we can do. We are doing the work. We are exhausted, right? And meeting together and getting the opportunity to come together in this way, I think, because everyone here is invested, right? Because it's time that we're giving to one another. And so we're already invested in the work. And I really like what you're saying, Joan, about connecting to each other and supporting one another and making it more efficient. I really like that, so that we're not, sitting in our little silos, because that's what that Wendigo force. And for those that don't know the reference, that's like an all-consumptive energy that we talk about in some of our Anishinaabe, and I'm Plains Cree, but some of our indigenous narratives have this figure, and for us it's a spirit, right? So that spirit is very much alive, but there's always the antidote to those spirits too, right? And then that comes from understanding our responsibilities and obligations as humans, right? And so I'm really I really want to say thank you, Kanena Scumpton, to each of you. As a grandmother, I have 2 granddaughters, and so yeah, I'm fighting too. I'm on the front lines as well, and in different ways. I think we're coming at different angles to the same purpose, right? The same outcome we want. And so I really love that lasting message of let's find the ways that we can come together as we move forward. That to me is most inspiring, because I'm here. I'm here for the long haul. And I would rather be with a bunch of people who are also here for the long haul. So I really love that. And Mickey mentions making connections between the issues and coming together seems to be part of the solution. Yes, I think meeting everyone through the symposium, and I would suggest, and I'm like on a panel in 25 minutes and I'll suggest it again there, but we somehow have a mechanism to connect afterwards. Like, and I don't know what that looks like in terms of the organizers, but like maybe an interested sign up communications sheet, a web, something where we can continue to connect, because I think sometimes with these symposiums we meet each other and then we all go off in our separate ways, and then we're like, wait, no, I really like what Joan was saying, I want to hear more about Joan, right? And so just as follow up, you know, something to continue the work and to continue fostering those relationships. Yeah.
If I may jump in there, I'm so glad you mentioned the financial portion, Joan. I think it's critical. I put on my consultancy hat now, and I did the white paper for the National Strategy for Circular Economy in Ecuador. And I know circular economy has been controversial in the political ecology realm. Nonetheless, if we get the right people in the room, we can actually, because there is not a lot of theory behind it, we can actually make it better, right? We can transform it and make it so that it addresses social justice. So that's what I was doing. And one of the key things was, okay, how are we building capacity in the financial sector, not only in banks and how credit is given, but also microcredit, and how are we building the association's ability to handle finances so that these zero waste programs can actually be better for the communities and scale better, and show the world that it can be done in complicated settings like large cities. So I really do believe that, you know, in this ecological framework of policy, and then you know, all of the production, and then looking at consumption here, we do have to get into the policy framework and the financial settings to adequately feed into production and how citizens can actually live coherently, or the way they want to be living.
Right.
That's
Thank you so much, Melanie. I don't know what time we're supposed to end, Mickey. I'm like, I could just talk all day, but
let's pour some tea.
yeah.
I think we should give everybody a break. There's another panel coming up, and it's on ecological grief. And I think it's really going to be a very important panel too. So thank you, everybody. It seems like we just get more and more moved by everything that is happening here. And we're really grateful for everybody. You know, you're all just cherished guests, and thank you. And we're hoping to see you for the next panel in 25 minutes. So
Okay, I better go get more tea.
thank you so much. Thank you, Tasha.
Everyone.
Thank you to all the presenters.
Again. Thank you. See you in a bit, hopefully.